So I will start with a brief introduction of myself and SEA Junction for those who are not familiar with this place, although there are many familiar places too, and then give the floor to the focus on the Global South, which this time is our partner in this. I am very honored to be here with Walter Bello in person because, as you know, he's quite the personality. If you read this CV, you can see that he has gone through activism as well as intellectual. He's one of the main intellectuals in the field with a critical perspective. So I look forward to listen to you and learn about what he has to say. So my name is Lia Sciortino. I am Italian but lost in Southeast Asia for more than 30 years. Worked on international development. I'm now semi-retired, teaching in a university. I am glad to see quite a group of the mates. Actually, it's the global study program from Germany, which is studying at at the moment. And I also started SEA Junction, and SEA Junction is this venue that you see. It's a Thai foundation which is devoted to spreading knowledge about Southeast Asia, all dimensions of Southeast Asia, the challenges as well as the beauty of the region. And today, of course, we are very much interested to understand more about the geopolitics of the region. There is a lot of attention about China, China bashing, especially these days with the coronavirus. I think it's quite actual, but we will be talking about the US, which the presence or absence for sure makes a difference for this region too. So I will give the floor to Shamali, who is the director of the Focus on the Global South, and she will introduce the organization as well as Walden in more detail.
Thank you very much, Leah. So thank you all for coming here in the middle of COVID-19. This is like love in the time of cholera, except we did say something in the time of COVID. Anyway, my organization is Focus on the Global South, and just go to the website and you will see www.focusweb.org, and you will see our publications and the work we do. But just a very quick introduction is we call ourselves an activist think tank, meaning we do research and analysis, but we do it in collaboration with and from the perspectives of people who are in the middle of situations and facing the brunt of different types of trends. Our main areas of work are political economy of development, power and democracy, and also people's alternatives. And the main types of work we do is research analysis, a lot of popular education, and then convening and bringing people together in discourses, debates, to try to forge some kind of more common political consensus. But if, of course, political consensus is not possible, we strongly believe in the importance of diversity and debate and discourse, and not following a doctrinaire path towards trying to bring about social change. Anyway, so that's basically what we do. Now, Dr. Walter Bello is our co-founder. He started the organization in 1995 with another person who has subsequently moved on to other institutions. And Walden has been with Focus. He's led the organization for a long time. In between, he left and joined Philippines Congress for a while, where we all, of course, made his life hell, and so did the Philippine activists. Chris knows, being a Filipina. And Walden also resigned from the Philippines Parliament as a conscientious objector to the actions of his own party, and he is teaching also now at the State University of New York in Binghamton in the sociology department. But of course, for us, what is very important is that Walden came back to Focus as our senior analyst to help us to take a sort of a bird's eye view on what's happening in the region and how geopolitics are affecting the Asia region. Because we have this craziness about China, but there are also other actors and so on. So anyway, that's enough enough about focus, and let me just hand the floor over to Warren to present his latest analysis on how the U.S. has continued to engage with Asia and what is new or what is different about the way the United States has engaged with Asia, and how does this engagement then play out, correspond or not with the political engagement of other large powers and political forces and economic forces in Asia. Warren, over to you. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, and I'd like to thank Rosalia for inviting us to present here, and also the generous introduction by my colleague, Shalmani Gato. Okay, so what I'll do is just present a couple of slides on the theme of Trump and the Asia Pacific. What is new and what is old, and what are the concerns that governments and people in the Asia Pacific have about the direction of U.S. policy. So, okay. So, this is Donald Trump on the very first full day that he was in office. He signed a number of executive orders, and the one that he was really very proud of was the executive order withdrawing the United States from the negotiations on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and this is it. The same press conference, he had a number of people from labor in the United States, including the AFL-CIO, which had been in fact demanding that the United States no longer sign such trade agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So Trump's dramatic withdrawal from the TPP at the very beginning of his first term alarmed U.S. allies in the Asia-Pacific region, who saw it as signifying that, one, the U.S. was in the process of disengaging from Asia, and two, it was giving up on multilateralism, which was supposed to be represented by the TPP, and embracing unilateralism. In the next few months, anxiety piled up as Trump tweeted about U.S. allies not sharing the burden of their military alliances with the United States. As a former Japanese Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs wrote recently, about 2 months ago, quote, Trump's call for allies to pay the full cost of hosting U.S. bases is rooted in the false understanding that bases are only for the benefit of host nations and fails to recognize the substantial benefits for the United States and the region of maintaining U.S. forward deployment, unquote. The result has been, quote, a staggering decline in U.S. leadership that has a destabilizing effect on East Asia as the avenues for U.S. allies and partners to engage the United States in multilateral cooperation have narrowed considerably, unquote. Yes, a photo may be worth 1,000 words, but it is misleading. The reality is that the United States under Trump is not disengaging from Asia because the principal drive pushing its engagement has been the strategic extension of the reach of U.S. power. The U.S. is not withdrawing from multilateral cooperation because unilateralism has never been, multilateralism has never been its mode of engagement with the Asia-Pacific in the first place. Unlike in the case of the expansion in Latin America, the main reason for the U.S. presence in the Asia-Pacific has not been to promote and protect diffuse U.S. corporate interests, but to project the strategic reach of the U.S. state. This has been the case since Commodore Perry, quote-unquote, opened up Japan in 1853 to the United States' 8,000-mile lead to the Philippines in 1898, to the non-demobilization of the Seventh Fleet and the creation of a massive transnational garrison state spanning 3 countries and United Nations trust territories since the end of the Second World War. So this is Commodore Perry opening up Japan that led to the crisis of the shogunate in Japan. And this is Admiral Dewey crushing the Spanish fleet on May 1st in Manila Bay, 1898. And this is the USS Ronald Reagan, which is a super carrier whose home port is the U.S. Naval Base in Yokosuka, Japan. The priority of power projection. I just wanted to have 2 quotes here that shows what really U.S. deployment in the Pacific is all about. And I quote, the first, the Philippines is the finest group of islands in the world. Its strategic location is unexcelled by any other position in the globe. The China Sea, which separates it by something like 750 miles from the continent, is nothing more than a safety moat. It lies on the flank of what might be called several thousand miles of coastline. It is the center of that position. It is therefore relatively better placed than Japan, which is on a flank, and therefore remote from the other extremity, likewise India on another flank. It affords a means of protecting American interests, which, with the very least output of physical power, has the effect of a commanding position in itself to retard hostile action, unquote. This was the view of General Arthur MacArthur, who led the army forces that colonized the Philippines in 1899. Okay, then in 1945, another MacArthur, the son, who had just emerged as the key person in the U.S. military hierarchy that had defeated Japan and went on to serve as the Yankee Emperor in Japan. And this is what he had to say. Quote, the strategic boundaries of the United States were no longer along the western shore of North America and South America. They lay along the eastern coast of the Asiatic continent. And this idea about the strategic boundary of the United States being basically on what MacArthur would have called the first island chain from northern Japan through Okinawa, through the Philippines, and Taiwan and the Philippines. This was supposed to now serve as the strategic boundary, and the U.S. has never really departed from this kind of strategic thinking. Its drive to establish strategic maritime supremacy, the U.S. Navy in the 19th century invoked commercial rationales. But it was the case that more often trade followed the flag more than the flag followed trade. Later, in the post-World War II era, hasty economic rationales like the need to protect raw material resources were invoked for the U.S. military intervention, as in the Vietnam War. But the reality was that economic interests of U.S. corporations were marginal. The marginal role continued from the 1950s to the 1980s, as Washington turned a blind eye to the policies of protectionism, investment discrimination, and strong state support for local businesses of Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, while allowing their subsidized exports easy entry into the U.S. market. This These policies severely disadvantaged U.S. corporations and traders, but Washington judged this cost to be worth the political and military alliance it was able to extract as a quid pro quo from the Asian elites. It was only when the Cold War started to wind down during the Reagan presidency that corporate and trade interests also began to have a major role in the U.S. agenda for East Asia. Pressures for this shift had of course been building for years. Pressures based on the growing and accurate perception of both American corporate executives and trade officials that the prosperity of Japan and the so-called newly industrializing countries had been purchased at the expense of U.S. economic interests. In sum, the projection of the power of the American state has been the central determinant of the U.S. expansion in the Asia-Pacific region, and this is more powerful and lasting than the promotion or maintenance of diffuse economic interests. So, the Great Pacific Trade-off, strategic subordination for economic prosperity. And for a long time, it was felt by both Washington and Japan and the Asian elites that this was a worthwhile trade-off. Okay, multilateral alliances. The reality is that in East Asia, the United States did not need multilateral alliances to exercise its power as it did in Europe. As John Eikenberry, Princeton professor of international relations, observes, quote, in Europe, the United States had an elaborate agenda for uniting European states, creating an institutional bulwark against communism, and supporting centrist democratic regimes, unquote. While in Asia, unchallenged hegemonic power meant that the United States had fewer incentives to secure its dominant position through international institutions that would have circumscribed its independent decision-making, unquote. Whereas another analyst, the conservative Robert Tucker, has put it, quote, in Asia, much more than in Europe, we have clients rather than allies, unquote. Are Democrats more multilateralist than Republicans? No. Just one example, the presidency of Bill Clinton, 1992 to 2000, while it preached multilateralism, was as unilateralist as any Republican administration when it came to East Asia. There, Clinton actively opposed moves to multilateralize the existing security system dominated by Washington. The White House, for instance, systematically subverted the ASEAN Regional Forum, promoted by the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. For all its flaws, the ARF was a step in the direction of a collective security system. Yet the U.S. boycotted the founding meeting of the ARF in Bangkok in July 1994 to register Washington's disapproval of ASEAN's ambitions. Clinton indeed denigrated the ARF and other multilateral security initiatives, saying that, quote, they are a way to supplement our alliances and forward military presence, not supplant them, unquote. As the U.S. Congressional Research Service candidly observed, Washington did not look kindly at the ARF because, quote, a problem would arise if East Asian governments use the ASEAN Regional Forum and other future consultative organizations in attempts to restrain the United States from acting on certain security issues. Aside from undermining the ARF, the other unilateral action by Clinton plunged the region to one of its most tense confrontations since the end of the Vietnam War. This was his sending of 2 aircraft carrier battle groups to the Taiwan Straits in response to Chinese military exercises in March 1996 near Taiwan. And this was done without consultation of allies who would have been impacted by an outbreak of conflict. From that time on, at the time when China was still considered by Washington as some sort of a strategic partner, the China military buildup in the Pacific began because they did not want to be again in a position of being threatened in the way that they were in 1996. And William Perry, the defense chief of President Clinton, at that time, in fact, admitted that this was what triggered the U.S., the Chinese military buildup in the Asia Pacific. Okay. As with its strategic policy, Washington's instinctive response was not multilateral in economic relationships, but unilateral. Rather than make use of the general agreements on tariffs and trade, a multilateral mechanism for settling trade disputes, the Reagan administration used heavy-handed direct pressure, forcing Japan to agree to the Plaza Accord in 1985, which drastically revalued the yen relative to the dollar, making Japanese imports to the U.S. less attractive and placing quote-unquote voluntary restraints on its exports of automobiles to the United States. This was a time that the Cold War was winding down, and basically U.S. corporations began to push Washington, saying that, look, it's time we change the relationship with the Asian economies because we've been prevented by the political alliance, which has been uppermost, from in fact benefiting from the so-called Pacific or Asia-Pacific miracle. Unilateral action was also taken against what had come to be known as the Asian Tigers, or newly industrializing countries, with the U.S. deploying a host of weapons, including anti-dumping suits, ending preferential tariffs for their exports, placing them on the so-called Super Trio 1 watch list of quote-unquote unfair traders, and pressing them to liberalize foreign investment regulations. Warning the NICS to comply, a senior official of the Treasury Department of the Reagan administration said, quote, although the NICS may be regarded as tigers because they're strong, ferocious traders, the analogy has a darker side. Tigers live in the jungle, and by the law of the jungle, they are a shrinking population, unquote. So this was basically Washington's rollback against its Asian allies economically. The big opportunity to discipline and resubordinate the Asian economies came in the wake of the Asian financial crisis in 1997 to 1998. Desperate for loans to bail them out, the countries in crisis went cup in hand to the International Monetary Fund, while the U.S. pushed the IMF to make rescue money dependent on these countries' commitment to liberalize their trade and investment rules. In Korea, the United States did away with the intermediate role of the IMF and took direct control of the restructuring process. The result of this unilateral list management was that at the end of the decade of quote-unquote reform, the vaunted Korean developmental state had been replaced by a neoliberal state. No longer was Korea the quote most difficult place in the world to do business, quote, as U.S. corporations were wont to complain for the crisis. More broadly, there was truth to be discerned in the words of the late Asia expert Chalmers Johnson that Washington's unilateralist behavior towards its East Asian allies during the financial crisis and its aftermath reflected the fact that, quote, having defeated the fascists and the communists, the United States now sought to defeat its last remaining rivals for global dominance, the nations of East Asia that had used the conditions of the Cold War to enrich themselves, unquote. Now, Trump's economic war with China certainly falls into this unilateral tradition of seeking structural change. However, it is much more radical and encompassing compared to the previous U.S. efforts to restructure Asia's economies. First of all, it defines China as a, quote, economic aggressor, an epithet Washington never applied to its previous Asian targets. Second, it seeks not incremental and sequential reforms for what it calls the state-driven economic model, but drastically replaces the model in total, including, in the case of China, eliminating the directive role of the Communist Party, both at the macro level as well as in economic enterprises. Third, It also seeks to decouple China and the United States, that is, to end U.S. dependence on China for manufactured consumer exports and China's dependence on the U.S. for high technology. This is to be accomplished not only by imposing punishing tariffs, but for a raft of investment restrictions and export controls that would sever supply chains and discourage financial integration, including delisting Chinese corporations on Wall Street. Fourth, it discourages U.S. transnational corporations from investing in China, mainly through high tariffs placed on imports from China, a big portion of which are goods manufactured in that country by U.S. subsidiaries or subcontractors, a move that has already led to some corporations shutting down their China operations. Fifth, the administration's policy makes the rejuvenation of the U.S. industrial base and U.S. monopoly of high technology a national security issue. Thus, it seeks to deprive China of access to the latest developments in high tech by invoking national security reasons. In the most publicized case, the U.S. banned the Chinese high-tech corporation Huawei from obtaining technology developed by U.S. firms to develop its 5G telecommunications technology. Huawei, the U.S. alleged, had been funded and worked closely with the Chinese state, which would use technology obtained from the U.S. for military purposes. Now, Washington has also continued to follow a policy of disciplining its own allies, even as it engages China in a trade war. In 2019, the U.S. Commerce Department imposed 400% tariffs on steel from Vietnam, saying that both certain products produced in South Korea and Taiwan were shipped to Vietnam for minor processing before being exported to the United States. Trump described Vietnam as, quote, almost the single worst abuser of everybody, unquote. That's communist language. Also in 2019, the administration pushed Japan to a trade deal that got the Japanese to lower tariffs on U.S. agricultural goods to mollify American farmers that had lost much access to the China market owing to the U.S.-China trade war, without removing tariffs on Japanese cars entering the U.S., which Japan had wanted desperately. South Korea was not exempt from U.S. pressure, with Trump in 2018 forcing a renegotiation of the existing Korea-U.S. free trade agreement to get more U.S. cars sold in Korea by, among other things, lifting a cap on U.S. car exports to South Korea that don't need to meet Korean safety standards. Trump was obviously not satisfied that U.S. automobile exports to Korea went up by over 300%, from $419 million in 2011 to $1.7 billion in 2018. So, the Korean government has to appeal to Korean consumers to buy American cars. It's crazy. Okay. Washington in 2019 also withdrew duty-free treatment on $1.3 billion worth of goods from Thailand on the grounds that the country had not done anything to address violations of labor rights in its fishing industry. While the act certainly advanced workers' rights, many analysts were wondering if there was more than met the eye in Washington's action, especially since it came on the heels of a U.S. State Department report commending Thailand for making progress in curbing human trafficking, one of the problems in its fishing industry. As one report noted, I quote, "It's unclear if Trump's decision to suspend part of Thailand's GSP trade preferences, while small in relative trade terms, served as a warning of a potential bigger conflict if Bangkok fails to make more concessions to U.S. business interests and uphold its previous, quote-unquote, made in America import promises," unquote. In brief, it is difficult to characterize the U.S. economic relationship with China's East Asian neighbors under Trump as disengagement. In fact, even as it was waging a trade war with China, a first step in its ambition to transform China's political economy, it was deepening its unilateralist micromanagement of this country's trade policies. As with its strategic policy, continuation of unilateralism, not multilateralism, has been the defining feature of Trump's economic relationship with the Asia Pacific. Okay, this is the most influential economic book in the United States, over the last 4 years. This is Peter Navarro. He is Trump's trade advisor, and basically he is the brains behind Trump's very aggressive anti-China policies. Now, why the Trump administration is so destabilizing for the Asia-Pacific. Despite moves in the direction of consolidating an anti-China posture, Obama's as well as Bush's strategic approach towards China was subverted by the strong trade ties that coupled the U.S. and China and U.S. corporations' dependence on China's cheap labor for their profits. Economic interests and strategic interests, in the opinion of many in the U.S. elite, diverged dangerously. In this respect, Trump is different from his predecessors in that he has defined China both as a strategic and economic foe, distancing himself from the pro-globalization and softened China posture of powerful factions of the U.S. policy-making, corporate, and academic elites. This makes the Pentagon quite happy since it has corralled Washington's civilian leadership into viewing China with the same lens, not just as a strategic competitor, but a strategic enemy. There are 3 alarming developments in the Asia-Pacific arms race under Trump, and let me flag them just to show that the U.S. is not disengaging. Probably the most destabilizing military move made in the Western Pacific under Trump was Washington's deployment in 2017 of a sophisticated anti-ballistic missile defense system known as the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense in South Korea in 2017. While the U.S. and South Korea claimed that the THAAD installation was aimed at intercepting and destroying missiles coming from North Korea, Beijing felt that they were also, if not primarily, directed at subverting China's strategic nuclear defenses against the United States. Second, on the heels of the THAAD deployment came the announcement in August 2019 that the United States was withdrawing from the International Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF, signed between Gorbachev and Reagan in 1985, with the intention of deploying intermediate-range ballistic missiles to the Asia-Pacific. There was little ambiguity that the planned deployment was for offensive purposes and that it was directed at China. Third, there is the U.S. adoption of the strategic doctrine of overmatch. That is, that the United States must more than match the military might of a peer rival or near peer rival or coalition of rivals. This is now the U.S. strategic doctrine. At the global level, overmatch will mean a continual striving for massive superiority, since the United States will never be sure it has achieved massive superiority. At the regional level, in the Asia-Pacific, overmatch feeds into the strategy of air-sea battle that the Pentagon admits it's an offensive strategy designed to penetrate China's anti-missile defense replacements. It is profoundly destabilizing because it will endlessly try to overcome whatever perceived improvements China is able to make to its defensive AD emplacements. It sparks an uncontrolled arms competition between two powers and will entail constant probing of China's defenses, such as the provocative patrols that the U.S. strategic bombers and U.S. Navy carry out near Chinese-controlled maritime formations in the Spratly Islands with the justification of, quote, ensuring freedom of navigation. An unregulated balance of power competition, many have warned, can create a situation wherein a ship collision between the U.S. and its allied ships and Chinese ships can quickly escalate into a major conventional conflict. During the author's visits to Vietnam, when I was still a member of the House of Representatives, my host, who had been engaged in a territorial row in Beijing, stressed how a simple ship collision can escalate into a major conflict. A similar balance of power had reigned in the early 20th century Europe, with the opposing forces then justifying it as a main mechanism to preserve the peace until it broke down and war broke out in 1914. So that's about it. Thanks a lot. Okay,
Thank you very much. I think it's a lot of information in a brief time. So I open the floor for 3 questions, comments, and then we will have about 2 rounds of questions and comments, giving an opportunity to reflect. Please. Good there. 1. Okay. I will. 2. Third one. Not yet. Okay. 1, please. Loud voice.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Well, the relationships, well, I think that the Americans, the Soviet-China rift was one of the major reasons for American policy shifts. But today, with Russia, is Russia a new friend of China? That's my question. Is Russia a new friend of China?
Yeah, I'm curious to know, what do the Philippines want, sort of microcosm, and what do the ASEAN countries want? I mean, we heard this is what the U.S. is, blah, 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 but I mean, what do they want? What do they want the U.S. to do?
Okay.
Yeah, my question is now. Okay. My question is, how would a positive multilateral policy of the United States look like by maybe other administration that is coming in the future? Because you were showing like negative policies in the past only. Like how would a positive policy look like that?
Well, to the first question, definitely Russia and China have been on much more friendly terms, over the last several years. And there is, however, no formal alliance between them. But they have held joint military exercises together, several times. And whether or not this will be translated to a formal strategic alliance, we still have to see. So that is a developing relationship. The second thing is, the second question, well, as you know, the ASEAN is very much at sea at the moment with respect to this. I think that most of the countries in ASEAN until around 2015 wanted to really press China to begin talks on what it called the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea, that China had in fact promised in 2002 that it would do this, but never really has lived up to that promise. As things began to get worse because of the situation in the South China Sea, the ASEAN pretty much split on taking a more direct posture towards China. Most of the ASEAN countries basically wanted to sign a communique, that would put, a strong and direct appeal to China to stop its moves in the South China Sea, or what in the Philippines we call the West Philippine Sea. But Cambodia vetoed it. I think this was around 2013, 2012, I'm not sure of the date now. And this was the first time that ASEAN did not come out of a summit meeting with a communique. Now, then in 2016, President Duterte of the Philippines, he was elected president, and from the very beginning, he was quite negative about the role of the United States and the alliance with the United States. And people initially thought this was a personal thing against President Obama because Obama had criticized his anti-drug war. But looking at the record, it seems like he had already developed very strong views that, that the United States was not benefiting, the Philippines was not benefiting from the alliance with the United States, which was engaged in which had about, the pillars of which were about three treaties. So just recently, Duterte withdrew or terminated the visiting forces agreement with the United States. And well, basically, the situation really is this. The U.S. Whenever the Philippine government went to the U.S. in the past and said, "Are you going to support us because of our mutual defense treaty with you? If we deal with China in the South China Sea," and the U.S. response has always been, that we do not interfere with sovereignty issues. So basically, that you're on your own. Okay? And at the same time, the U.S. was drawing us to a very, very deep military alliance directed at China, to the point that it was able to get bases from the previous administration, which would be very important for military deployments when it came to pushing the U.S. air-sea battle strategy. And so it was a very lopsided thing, and I think that I'm not sure exactly about what was going on in Duterte's mind, but clearly many of us do not support Duterte because of his human rights violations. Nevertheless, have seen that this has been a positive move because it was moving us away from a useless and in fact dangerous military relationship. Whereas in fact what we should be doing is having an independent foreign policy that does not side with either the US or China. So I think right now most of the ASEAN countries would still want negotiations to start on a code of conduct in South China Sea, and especially those countries that are directly affected by the territorial claims of China infringing on their own territorial claims. And this is Indonesia, this is Malaysia, Vietnam, and the Philippines. So that's the situation right now. Now, with respect to the third question, what would be a positive multilateral policy be? Well, I think that, first of all, I think it would be very important for the United States to begin to respect other countries' desire to have a collective security agreement. Because right now the U.S. has constantly avoided or constantly said, we don't need a collective security agreement. We don't need diplomatic mechanisms. The best assurance you have for your safety is U.S. military power. And I'm not saying that. This is what U.S. presidents have always said. So I think that would be an important step forward for a future U.S. administration to promote a kind of a collective security mechanism that would allow conflicts to be settled diplomatically rather than militarily as a first resort. We saw the danger back in 1996. And right now, there is really no mechanism that would be able to restrain a superpower conflict in the region. It's just this balance of power. China builds up, the U.S. builds up, so it becomes a very unstable equilibrium until at some point the equilibrium breaks. And this is why many of us are looking into what happened in Europe in 1914, where you had a similar mechanism of balance of power. Everybody said it would work, but then it went awry, and then we had those terrible 4 years of conflict in the First World War. With respect to the economic relationships, I think that we do need, the United States would have to be open to a new kind of multilateralism, one that respects the rights of countries to be able to enact their own trade policies, and not always to be pushing the interests of its transnational corporations. We need something, we need a relationship that does not say that, well, whenever our investors are threatened by your actions, nationalization, we can bring you to court. You know, the ISDS mechanism. We need something that says that that would say that intellectual property rights are not the be-all and the end-all. That in fact, the common good, like in the case of cures for all sorts of diseases, should have a priority over the intellectual property rights of corporations. We need, a kind of relationship with the United States that would respect the other countries, if they in fact enacted trade mechanisms to protect their industries in order from being swamped with goods or agricultural goods from the United States. So that is the sort of non-free trade economic cooperation that we really need. And the TPP, which Trump vetoed, was in fact a very, very pro-corporate, pro-U.S. corporate kind of mechanism. And the RCEP that is being negotiated right now, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, is maybe also moving in the direction of putting corporate interests above national, domestic, and popular interests. So there's a whole overhaul that needs to be done at this point. But the point is that the point I'm making here is that it's almost like you have to start from scratch, because the U.S. there's never been a multilateral mechanism, either strategically or economically, that has governed our relationships with the United States. The U.S. has always related to us unilaterally, whether on the economic area or in the strategic area, and that is a strong crying need at this point.
Second round.
Okay.
Second round of questions. Anyone also? Not yet? Okay, so please.
Why do you think that the United States has dealt historically with Southeast Asia, and maybe with Asia in general, in a unilateral way, where it's dealt with Europe in a multilateral way, particularly at the end of World War II and following? It worked hard to work with allies there, but it's almost as if the U.S. has historically considered Southeast Asia not quite a vassal state, but certainly less. Oh, why do you think that is?
Well, I think first of all, I think you did have, when it came to the European allies after the Second World War, although the U.S. was certainly, a hegemonic power, nevertheless, you did have allies that, like Great Britain, United Kingdom, France, and others that were fairly well developed countries and did have significant militaries. In fact, Britain and France had been able to develop nuclear capabilities at that time, and And indeed, you also had the U.S. It was really also worried about the fact that you had a lot of the populations in these countries, being supportive of communist parties. So I think the U.S., for all these reasons, the U.S. Pushed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization with strong decision-making powers, dominated by the United States, but nevertheless, where its allies had a strong say. So I think that, especially facing the Soviet Union at that point in time in Eastern Europe, and the Soviet Union having its own set of allies in Eastern Europe, that it was felt that you needed to have a more legitimate kind of operation, a more legitimate kind of alliance that did in fact respect the voice of the allies of the United States. And de Gaulle tested this, as you know. De Gaulle basically, withdrew French forces from the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, despite the fact that Britain and the others were very upset, that this had happened. France rejoined later on, but that was, you had that strong element, that the United States felt that it couldn't just push its way unilaterally as it did in Asia. Now, what was the problem? The problem with the situation in Asia was quite different. We had a thoroughly defeated Japan, okay, and you had a situation whereby something they did not do in Europe, which was to basically fill Japan with military bases. Up to now, Japan is not only Okinawa, but all the way through Japan, you had a tremendous American military occupation presence, and and the U.S. was pretty much had its way here. It did not have sort of French sector, British sector, as in the occupation of Germany. Pretty much this was very harsh terms on a defeated country. And in fact, for all intents and purposes, until around 1952, MacArthur was an emperor of Japan, and pretty much Washington pretty much let the guy do whatever he wanted. That was how bad it was. With respect to Korea, again, Korea was basically just a dependence in the United States, which it had to rescue during the Korean War. We had, basically it was the United States that provided most of the troops to settle the Korean War. It was only nominally a UN command, but basically what you had was governments and militaries that were totally under the control of Washington. And then you had, in the Philippines, you had two big military bases in addition to many other bases. And the Philippines was, of course, a U.S. ally, during the Second World War, having been a former colony. So it had some degree of space that neither Korea nor Japan had. But nevertheless, that space was fairly limited. Domestically, there was no question that we were independent in terms of settling our domestic affairs, but foreign policy-wise, it was fully controlled by the United States. So we did not have the sort of strong governments that you had in Europe. We had basically client states that were pretty much supplied in their military by the United States. So I think this is one of the reasons why you had clientelism rather than alliance really built into the relationship with East Asia and Southeast Asia. Of course, there are differences with respect to different countries in Southeast Asia, but nevertheless, I think that at that time, the U.S. was of course, as you know, the U.S. was also propping up South Vietnam. I mean, that was against North Vietnam. North Vietnam and China was on the opposite side of the fence, and Indonesia, of course, was. And Malaysia was another case, but the U.S. also heavily intervened in these countries to the point that basically U.S. support for the Suharto coup back in 1965, it was not the central factor, but it was very important. And the United States forged a very strong dependent relationship with the Suharto regime that emerged from that. So the point, therefore, that I'd like to stress is what you had in Asia were weak client states, whereas what you had in Europe were relatively strong allies that demanded some respect and that did have their own space to make decision making, especially when it came to military and economic policies.
Okay, we open this one. Any more? Two? Okay.
Just expanding on that question, thinking about the US as a unilateral power, I mean, if you kind of think about other theaters and you look at the Middle East, and I think you mentioned Latin America as well, I mean, besides Europe, would you just consider, would your theory also apply to the rest of the world besides Europe, that the US acted in a unilateral way?
Well, sorry.
So my question is on human rights. How do you see the U.S. influencing human rights in the ASEAN region, particularly in the background of this political economy? And as a human rights activist yourself, we're starting to see more discourses in the human rights field on China's influence on human rights in the region, but very few discourses on the U.S. influence. So how do you see the U.S. playing a role in human rights in Asia, if it should play a role in human rights in Asia?
That's a very good question. To the first question, I think my sense is, with respect to Latin America, that you had the priority of economic interests. Traditionally, what we had was the United States trade and economic relations were most developed with Europe, but next it was with Latin America. And in the case of Latin America, all the major U.S. interventions were very much related to supporting and protecting corporations. Okay? Whether it was in Guatemala against Arbenz, who threatened to expropriate United Fruit, and basically Washington came in and practically just threw the guy out. And another major intervention, of course, was in Chile in 1972, where, although it was not the major thing, U.S. support to take out Allende was very important, although this was carried out mainly by the Central Intelligence Agency. And in many of the other interventions in Latin America, the link with economic interests of corporations was very strong. Okay, whether it was in Brazil, in Central America, and the Dominican Republic. And whenever people have an image of the United States as an imperial power, it's oftentimes this image that it is the state goes to the rescue of corporations, or the state does the bidding of corporations, which is why I think that there's a tendency to then impose that model on other parts of the world, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work because the first thing that you see is that why the U.S. allow such states as Korea and China and Southeast Asian states to build up their economies at the expense of U.S. corporations. And it's not explainable within that model, but you can explain it, if you look at the priority of strategic interests in the Asia Pacific. I must confess that when it comes to the Middle East, maybe the Middle East would fall more along the lines of the Asia Pacific kind of relationship, except for one thing, which is the predominance of the concern about oil and about making sure that those oil reserves in which U.S. oil corporations had staked so much claim and on which the United States had become so dependent prior to the last decade, and had built up all these alliances with Saudi Arabia and other countries. My sense there is that, for the most part, because of the strong emphasis on supporting U.S. corporate or Western corporate interests in oil, and not only for profitability, but to assure a strategic, the oil reserves for the United States, I would say that it would fall more into this pattern of the priority of the economic interests. So that's what I would that's what I would say would characterize the U.S. relationships with the Middle East and with Latin America. I think that doesn't quite fit the kind of relationship it built up with Asian economies. Human rights. Okay. This is a very important question. First of all, at this point in time, it's fairly clear that there's been a de-emphasis on any kind of human rights diplomacy on the part of the Trump administration. One can see that, for instance, in the case of the Philippines, where Trump basically has embraced preserving. Basically that, his words was that Duterte is doing a good thing, and he's carrying out an effective war on drugs, although it's already killed about more than 27,000 people. So I think that the United States has deprioritized human rights from the time that Obama was pushing it. The agency of the United States that was pushing human rights was the State Department, and I think that its independence under Trump has really declined. They still come out with reports on trafficking. They still come out with reports on human rights abuses. I think those reports are very useful, but I think the State Department has been downgraded within the Trump administration, and so has the human rights policy been downgraded. The other thing that needs to be said here is, that the U.S. push on human rights had a double standard that made it very vulnerable, which was, that when it came to economic rights, of course China would come back and say, look, what do you say you're respecting human rights when 1/4 or 1/3 of black men between the ages of 15 and 30 are in jail. Okay? And so the U.S. just had this very, very vulnerable position when it came to economic rights. And so you had this situation whereby the United States preferred not to deal with economic rights, could not answer China or Russia when it came to critiques about, hey, inequality is so high in your country, and basically I think that just showed for many that there was a sort of very hypocritical kind of posture that made it easily ridiculed by other countries. And I think this must be said that this was a the United States was very vulnerable when it came to this. Even many of the U.S. own allies, of course it was not very strong that they would put it, would basically say that, that there's a dissect, between political rights and economic rights when it comes to the United States. So basically, I think that a future U.S. administration will seriously address the question of economic rights, labor rights, inequality, we need to look at democracy, not just a purely political thing, but there's an economic dimension to it. And it's fairly clear that at this point in time, when inequality is so high throughout the world has never been more unequal than it is now, that now is the time to really put equality at the center of human rights discourse. And many organizations and civil organizations have been doing that, but it really needs to be, this is the time to really, push it at this point. Without, however, but we also need, though, to call governments that violate, what are traditional human and democratic rights. We need also to be able to continue to call them to account, like for instance in the case of China. But it has to be done in a way that is not seen as contributing to the destabilization of these countries, because that is a big worry sometimes, that people come back and say, well, you're really out to destabilize us. Okay, so we have to have a critique of, say, human rights and the situation of human rights and democratic rights in places like China, without being accused of having a Western destabilization agenda at this point in time. So, but it's something in the making. This kind of human rights policy or human rights approach that places economics and social justice at the center of things, because they have been separated much too long in the traditional human rights discourse.
Okay, last, if there is any pressing issue to still, okay, one, any more? Okay, and then I have also some.
Maybe one last question also regarding to what I asked before, looking at the elections which are coming up in the United States. Would be President Sanders be a hope for this new positive multilateralism and also for pushing human rights? Or is he just like a hope regarding to domestic politics in the United States?
If I may ask about the role of the United States in ASEAN, the starting of ASEAN, whether that could be seen as a multilateral kind of security, and you're
his policy or his foreign affairs, his thoughts on foreign affairs, he put an emphasis on withdrawing, from U.S. troops, from engagements all over the world where they had been pinned down for years. So I think his position on this is that, hey, Mr. Trump, you said that you were going to withdraw troops. How come they're still in Afghanistan and all of that? So I think there was this sense that he would start a process of real troop disengagement. Second is, I think he was committed to reducing the footprint of the United States in terms of military bases throughout the world, and that would of course have a major impact on the U.S. on the Pacific. My sense is that he would probably move in the area of a multilateral kind of arrangement rather than a unilateral kind of arrangement when it came to the Asia Pacific. When it came to the Middle East, I think it's been clear that he feels that the big issue in the Middle East has been the way that Israel has trampled on Palestinian rights, and he's become very vocal on this, that he feels that that the U.S. alliance with Israel that allows Israel to get away with almost anything must be transformed. And so my sense is that he will also be for reducing the defense budget. So, but basically, I think he represents a very different kind of approach towards the world, and it's comprehensive. And I think that he's not been afraid to say this in the past, and he has been isolated in the past, and he's been criticized in the past by the Democratic establishment for this. But I think what they really fear is that he would have a transformative foreign policy. And this is why what we find at this point is that we have the Cold War lobby and the pro-Israel lobby in the United States, and the traditional allies of the United States that feel that they're threatened by Trump's talk about disengagement are even more threatened by the possibility of Sanders coming to power at this point in time if he wins in the elections. So my own sense is that we have a very strong Cold War establishment in the United States that does not like either Trump or Sanders. Okay? Mainly because they feel that, because Trump is very, very unilateralist, right? And he does not even want the fig leaf of multilateral alliances. He just wants that it's either U.S. power or nothing. And alliances are a big problem. Why don't we just, deal with countries like we do in the Asia Pacific? Okay? So this is the worry that many within the Cold War lobby in the United States fear. And they fear that Sanders would make it even worse for them at this point in time. Now, having said that, I think it's fairly clear at this point to me, that Biden is going to win the nomination. And it does seem like that he has the lead in delegates at this point in time. And I think that, there are a number of factors that play into this. People say that the media has created this image that Sanders is going to really be a radical. Unfortunately, whether or not that's created purposely, that has had an effect. Because, whether we like it or not, what is motivating the Democratic primaries now is fear rather than hope. Now it still could change, but who knows what's going to happen at this point in time. But it does seem like Biden will be the candidate, and my sense is that if Biden is the candidate, you're going to have 4 more years of Trump. So anyway, he's very vulnerable on so many points. He's not going to win the Midwest because he's been for all those trade agreements, and and Trump can at least say to workers in the Midwest of the United States that what responsible for bringing him there last time is that I took you away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership that a guy like Biden supported. So that those dynamics are unfortunately going to play out, and my own sense is that the only person that had a realistic chance of beating Trump was Sanders. With respect to ASEAN, again, ASEAN was an ASEAN project, and I think it was it had an independent move on its own, and there were efforts on the part of ASEAN to become a center that would supplant unilateralism on the part of the United States. But these were very feeble efforts. There is the South, you had a number of things like the Southeast Asian nuclear-free zone, efforts at regional demilitarization of the people. You had the ASEAN Regional Forum. The strongest bid for ASEAN to place its fate in its hands when it came to the military strategy issues was the ARF, the ASEAN Regional Forum. And that's why I think the United States really sabotaged it. That's, and it was very clear, they were very worried that if you have this ASEAN Regional Forum that would become the mechanism for settling disputes, that would steadily marginalize the U.S. role. And this is why Clinton, who was a Democrat, of course, came out very strongly against it. And unfortunately, the Asian financial crisis, which swept the region in 1998, also swept away the credibility or the strength of the ASEAN Regional Forum. In fact, ASEAN's standing was severely hampered by the Asian financial crisis because, as we saw happening all over, the IMF and the United States took a very strong role in restructuring these economies, and that had an impact when it came to ASEAN and the ASEAN Regional Forum. Also, of course, we cannot just blame the United States. The ASEAN countries' governments also have a lot of responsibility for the fact that ASEAN has not become more of a real economic cooperation and political cooperation, because there's always this idea that we do not intervene in one another's affairs. And so what you have is at the political level, there's just an embrace of the status quo, whether it's a dictatorship, human rights violations are right, that sort of thing. And at the economic level, yes, they say that they're moving towards a free trade agreement, but even there, progress is very slow, and there's a lot of opposition within the populations to the kind of free trade agreements that ASEAN is moving forward to. So ASEAN basically is at this point in time, I would say that it's more of a club rather than a serious economic or political alliance. And certainly it's important that it has contributed to the peace in the region, especially among the ASEAN countries. But nevertheless, moving just from that to a real regional economy, I think it has been very weak in this area. And when it comes to politics, this idea of non-intervention has been a big barrier in terms of promoting a culture of democratization throughout ASEAN. The last point you raised is about Vietnam. I guess your question is why did Vietnam not get a better deal from the United States? Is this your point?
They won the war, right? In this case, they've seen as a strong state because they won the war compared to the other states which you say were in a position of vassal of the United States. But somehow the relationship, especially these days, is very much dependent also on the United States. Right? They 10 years later, they are very welcoming to the United States and U.S. power. So,
yes.
what is the deal there with Vietnam? Which situation is a little bit different from the other countries?
Well, I think the situation with Vietnam is very much like the situation with China. That basically, because you had a revolutionary transformation of the society, you had a very strong state that was built up, and the ability of the U.S., for instance, to penetrate Vietnam, is quite limited compared to, say, its ability to be able to penetrate other countries in the region. There is, in fact, a big difference between having waged a war of national liberation and being able to preserve your own direction. And I would say that clearly, for those of us in the Philippines who go to Vietnam, one of the things that really impresses you is that you have a very strong state compared to the Philippine state. Now that, of course, has its disadvantages when it comes to concerns about human rights and this sort of thing. But at the same time, it does have a very strong degree of sovereignty that I don't think you find in the other ASEAN countries. Now, with respect to the United States, I think it has dealt with the United States in the same way that China has, which is that you bring in foreign investment, but it will be on our terms. And I think both China and Vietnam have, yes, they have been welcoming of foreign investment, but they have also used it very strategically to transfer technology and to be able to build up their own industries. So, when people say that China and Vietnam have adopted neoliberal economics, I would not say that. I think, yes, they offer cheap labor, but I think overall it's a controlled kind of process whereby they're using investment and trade very strategically to build up the solidity of their economies. And that is something that I think Korea did, Japan did, and to a great extent, Vietnam and China have copied what Japan and Korea and even Taiwan did, which is, you access technology, you use trade in order to build up a strong domestic economy. And I think, of course, it's a more complicated situation than that, but I think they've been quite successful in both China and Vietnam have been quite successful in terms of using trade and investment from the outside to build up their own economies. Of course, one of the big problems here that we as progressives criticize them for is the way that they've used cheap labor as a mechanism to be able to attract technology and investment. And secondly, the lack of labor rights in these countries. So I think these are some of the things we need to take into account when we assess where China and Vietnam, as two similar countries with communist parties that want power, where they are at this point in time. I would just say though that compared, say, to other ASEAN countries, you do have stronger governance in these areas that are a plus when it comes to protecting you from hegemons like the United States, but in many ways is a minus when it comes to expansion of democratic rights within these countries. So it's a qualified answer, but that's the best I can give at this point.
Never be satisfied with everything, always plus and minus, it would seem. But thank you very much for this very